Hello, my name is Alex Isles, and in today's episode we're going to be looking at medieval Christmas. So thank you so much for joining us. In today's episode, obviously we're going to be looking at medieval Christmas, and what better way than to set the scene. So we've already looked at Anglo-Saxon Christmas, both the possibility of what the festival may have looked like during the pagan period, and then how it transformed in the Christian period with the growing importance of the 12 days of Christmas as celebrated by Alfred the Great, and also the Christmas traditions built up by the clergy at that time in Anglo-Saxon England. So now we're moving on into the medieval period, which in England or in the British Isles, we date roughly from 1066 when William the Conqueror invades, and then goes right through to the Tudors at the end of the War of the Roses, and that's when we sort of tidily bag up that period of history into one area, and we call it the Middle Ages. So that is the difference between what we call the Middle Ages and what I mentioned in a previous episode, the early Middle Ages, which is generally from the end of the Roman Empire in Britain, around about, which is dated to about 410 AD, right the way through till 1066. So that gives you a wee bit of framing for both the Anglo-Saxon period and the Middle Ages. So in the medieval period, Christmas would have been incredibly welcome, especially when you've got, again, a very structured society where you've got obviously the royalty at the top, then you've obviously got the clergy to one side, the knights and the landed lords on the other side, and then you've got the free people and then the peasants. And that's roughly how society is formed together, with the obligations to the various different groups within medieval society. When you've got that, you've got to understand that when you get to Christmas, this would have been an incredibly welcome festival because of all the hard work throughout an agrarian society where you're working throughout the whole of the year to produce a surplus for the Lord, and then suddenly you come to the end of this festival, you come to this and you've got a total of 12 days off, and that would have been incredibly welcome. Many medieval lords may have actually begrudged the period because you've suddenly got to realise that for those 12 days you can't have your peasants working. We've also had a look throughout history, and because of the number of saints' days, some medieval peasants might have actually had more time off throughout the year than some modern day Americans. So there's an interesting one for you to think about. With the various different saints' days and holidays, people obviously couldn't work. They had to celebrate the saints' day, which involved attending church and special food, feasts, fasting, time off. And so there was always a balance. It wasn't as if they were constantly in indentured servitude and like slaves all the time. There was also that balance, so that they would farm for a while and then they would do other jobs, and then obviously you can't farm continuously, you have to wait for the crops to grow, so they would have some of their own time as well. So it's a very interesting one to look at how the year would have been broken up for a medieval peasant. But going back to this as well, they would have also been incredibly thankful for Christmas, because when that time of year comes, suddenly you can rest, you can relax, there's special festivals, there's music, there's dancing, there's enjoyment, and also you can treat yourself to more rich foods than you would normally have had, access to more fish, to more meat, and also the relaxation that comes with that. It was also recorded by one of the medieval writers, a guy called William Fitzstephen, that actually during this period as well, there was a huge amount of decoration that went on throughout British towns and cities. And he says, and he's writing about London, that everyone would decorate their houses with holly, ivy, bay, and whatever the season of year could afford them. And so they would go around the place, and as they went around the place, they would then decorate their houses. And you can imagine suddenly a medieval town becoming far more green, far an added colour, with all the contrast between the red berries and the green plants that would be decorated on people's houses at this time of year. Following on from this, the church would be an incredibly important part of the Christmas festival, and an incredibly important part of the whole celebrations going on as well. There would be special services to commemorate the birth of Christ, but alongside this as well, we have the beginning of what we would recognise as the Nativity Plays occurring. This would actually start off with something we would call tropping. And tropping was where they would add additional lines and verses to songs and the Christmas services. And this built up and built up until eventually they would have additional characters added to the Christmas services. So they would add people like the Magi, who are the three kings. They would add King Herod. They would add in biblical prophets such as Jeremiah, Daniel, and also Moses. And so they would come up and they would have monologues, or they would have discussions with the priests, and the priests would maybe ask them questions that would open up the Christmas story to those people watching. And then that would eventually build up and build up and build up. And the Nativity, as we know it today, was created in the Middle Ages by St. Francis of Assisi. And what he did was he created a nativity story with the idea of the cattle shed, of the animals, and of the three kings arriving to actually help Italian peasants to better understand the story. So he was creating that because before then they didn't have the nativity as we understand it today. So obviously many people today as well, in Britain it's a big thing in primary schools where children will put on the nativity play and every child has to have a role and things like that, and it's something that we actually almost mock to a point within our society. Another part of Christmas was on the 28th of December, so after Christmas Day you can continue on, and there was additional festivals throughout the whole period. This was Childermas, and this was the Feast of the Holy Innocents. Now, that sounds lovely until you realize it's the feast that commemorated King Herod ordering his soldiers to go to Bethlehem and kill every child under the age of 2 in Bethlehem. Obviously that's accounted in the Bible, so Herod has heard that there is another king within his land who could be a rival to him. He becomes jealous and he goes, right, I'm going to have him killed. And so he sends off his soldiers, they kill all of the children under the age of 2, and is a part of the biblical prophecies that add together into Jesus being seen as the Messiah. And so when they had that, there was a greater focus on children on the 28th of December. And so children would be brought into the church and they would have parts given to them. And in many towns and cities, a child bishop would be elected for this day. And they would be able to fulfill the roles of senior clergy throughout towns and cities. And for a day, they would actually rule as the bishop. And so that's again where you see elements of possibly even stuff like the King of Saturnalia that we mentioned back in the Roman episode coming into the Christian medieval tradition slightly later on. But then at the same time, similar ideas can evolve in different places at different times. But the idea of the importance of children and also of the horrendous act that was occurred during Herod's reign all coming together to create the special day of the Feast of Childermas on the 28th of December was the next part of the Christmas celebrations. And then on the 1st of January, there was the Feast of Fools, which was also called the Feast of the Circumcision. So remembering that time after Christ's birth, where as a Jew, he would have then been circumcised. And so because of that, there was another element of role reversal. And so lots of weird stuff started happening, and the priests would do things like wearing their clothes inside out. They would eat inside of church for some reason. There were records of priests drinking copious amounts of wine, eating, for some reason, sausages. I'm not entirely sure why that's so ridiculous, but good on them. They would then eat sausages. Sometimes they would bring animals into the church like donkeys. Sometimes they would bray like donkeys. And the weirdest thing that I've read up on is the idea that they would actually create incense out of old shoes and burn that inside the church. So normally incense is made out of stuff like frankincense, myrrh, pleasant smelling things like that. And it's burnt inside of the church during the services in censers. But can you imagine incense, like buying a candle in a shop, and it would be made of like the smell of old shoes. You've got old boot leather from all of those feet, and it's been imbued with the smell of feet and hard work of a medieval individual. And I don't think that would be a very pleasant incense to burn inside a church, but it adds to this whole idea of a mockery of the normal social order and a sort of a chaos on this Feast of Fools. And they would do quite a lot of things like that. Throughout the whole Christmas period as well, for the clergy, it was a time where many of their harsher restrictions of a religious life would be released. And so there would be more elements of feasting. They'd have access to a lot more food. They would eat stuff like waterfowl, salmon, goat, wild boar. And alongside that as well, many of the monasteries would also give their monks and priests clothing. So they would be given a new gown or a new habit at Christmas time. So it was a gift giving to the religious element of society as well. Now, Christmas for a lord would look different to how Christmas would look for a peasant. Inside the manor, inside the castle, there is an element of gift giving, and this is all connected again to the social structure within the medieval society. Many of you will already know this, but the social contract within the religious and medieval society was there was those who fought, those who prayed, and those who worked. So within that you have obviously kings and royalty at the top of society. You have their lords underneath who provide their fighting men and their taxation to the kings, and then they have an element of their own personal freedom to rule their lands as they wish underneath the king's laws. And then below them you have the peasants who are protected by the lords, and in turn, when they are protected by the lords, they provide their labor to the lords, so there is a social structure. The church sits slightly outside of that, and when they sit slightly outside of that, they provide for the people by looking after their souls and providing the religious element of society as well, and a legal element too through biblical law. Then there's the people who are slightly outside of society, and those are people like merchants who fall both within to all of those different categories as well in different ways. Because of the huge amounts of money they have, they function like those different elements within society as well, and they can provide huge amounts of money to church establishments. They can finance wars, and they can also fight wars as private unlanded lords in some ways. And they also work, because obviously doing merchants' work is work as well. So they're a bit of a weird one. They sit outside of society. But at Christmas time, the lords and the wealthy within society are supposed to give out huge fine gifts. They give out these amazing gifts of fine clothing, jewelry to wear over the Christmas period. And this shows off their responsibility and their power within medieval society. And so they would do this, and they would then also on the 1st of January give out a second gift. So most gifts were given out on the 25th of December, and this was the fine gifts that you would, clothing and stuff like that, you'd wear throughout the whole of the Christmas period. And then on the 1st of January, there was something called first gifts. And the first gifts were a symbol of your fortune in the year to come. And so this would maybe be given by a close family member or friend who would want to show off the goodness of their heart and their hope for your luck in the coming year. Obviously, then that could also give an element maybe where someone who would give possibly bad fortune, or if the gift got broken or something like that, that would have an element of superstition on how that would reflect in your life as well. Moving on into the feast period of Christmas, that was done inside the Great Hall, and the Great Halls were decorated just like people's houses with holly, ivy and seasonal greenery. So the Great Halls already, and you've seen this in my episodes on Newcastle's Castle, these were fine buildings, very ornate, very interesting buildings in their own right, were now decorated out. And so you would have lots of greenery inside the Great Hall, and everyone would gather together. The tables were then set out, and as they were set out, obviously they would have what they would normally have in the Middle Ages, which is you'd have your trenchers, which you can actually see in the image just behind me, just right there, which would be stale bread, and then you would put your food on top of that. Alongside that, between every two, you would have a bowl to wash your hands, you would have a bowl for your soups or your stews, and then small portions or small bowls of salt as well. And you would then sit down. You would also have your knife and your spoon, and then also your trencher as well. And then one added element of the luxury within the medieval Christmas was that between courses, the tablecloths would actually be cleaned off as well and replaced with fresh tablecloths. So rather than having one throughout the whole feast, you would have that, and that would also show off the Lord's wealth, that they could do this, and they could change the tablecloth numerous times throughout the whole feast. Following on from this, you would have the first course, which would be a soup or a broth, which would be quite weak, and that would have small pieces of meat in the bottom. Then you'd have the second course, which would then have elements of a vegetable stew. Then the third course is when it starts becoming really fine, and then you have stuff like salmon, trout, crab, eels, oysters, a lot more shellfish, and then also stuff like mussels and things like that. As you enter the rest of the feast, you then have your legs of beef and mutton. Then also you have amazing things like veal, venison. You would have capon, suckling pig. You would have plover, crane, And then for the very, very wealthy, the powerful lords, you would have swans and alongside that as well, peacocks that we've roasted in their own feathers, brought out, and then that would be a great show. Or a wild boar's head on a platter. And these sort of things as well would show off your wealth and your power throughout the whole of the feast and what you were able to do. The sauces would be incredibly rich, mixed with wine and herbs and spices, and they would be quite thick sauces as well. And sometimes you'd have a bread sauce too, using the breadcrumbs left over in the kitchen. Following into dessert, you would have things like fruit custards. You would have lots of pastries, nuts, and glazed treats as well, using sugar and honey glazes. So quite rich foods, as well as absolute luxuries of oranges, dates, and figs as well, that would be brought in from warmer climates to show off the wealth. Huge quantity of wine and would be drunk by the wealthier classes, and then there would be ale for the poorer classes as well. And again, that would show a difference in society. And so you'd have the fact that the wealthier could afford wine to be imported from France mostly, and then following on from that as well, the poorer would drink ale, which would go off quite quickly, but would be produced within your own home, and the women of the family would produce ale, which people would drink. Now, it was also a really special time of year as well, because the serfs, the people outside, would be invited to actually come to the feast as well. So they could come inside their lord's hall. And when they came, different lords had different traditions. So sometimes all of your serfs would be invited. They'd come into the hall and they could all celebrate Christmas with you. Other lords were far more, let's say, conservative or restrictive, and they would only invite 2 of their serfs, the wealthiest and the poorest on their estate, and each of them would be allowed to invite 2 friends. So you're only having to bring 4 in. Again, traditions differed, but some lords would just say, oh, bring your own plate, bring your own knife and spoon, and then you would come in and you also had to bring your own firewood as well. But again, it depended on the estate, what the tradition would be. But when the serfs arrived, they got to enjoy some of the high life of being inside of the lord's estate and all of the great things that that brought as well. So it was a very comfortable experience for them, where otherwise they wouldn't get to experience that within their normal day-to-day lives. At the start of Christmas, peasants actually had to give a gift to their lords. And so rather than receiving a gift, the peasants on the estate had to make an additional gift to their lords. These additional gifts would often be in the form of more bread, eggs, additional things like that, or possibly even up to the form of livestock. So you might have to give some of your sheep or some of your chickens to the Lord as well. But those more skilled people, the more important people on the Lord's estates, they would in turn receive gifts from the Lord. So let's say people like smiths, craftspeople, alongside that as well, the chief swineherder or pig herder, and then alongside that as well as chief shepherd of the estate would receive additional gifts of wood and food and drink from their lord in turn. So the lord is taking in an additional tax from the peasants and then is redistributing that tax to the more important members of his society, which again, and this is something that we can see in other periods as well, such as like the gift giving that we see within the Dark Ages or the early Middle Ages, where lords would give out gifts to their key retainers or their key sub-lords, and then in turn they would pay their taxes back to the king, which they've gathered from their people as well. So there's always that level of gift giving backwards and forwards throughout the whole of society. The lords would also give out gifts to their key and most important members of their estate, so like the swineherd, the shepherd, people like that, on the 26th of December. And when they gave out those gifts, obviously on the 25th of December, they've given them out to their friends, their family, those who are staying on in the castle or in the Great Hall or in the manor. And then on the 26th of December, it's those key individuals, the key craftspeople on the estate, all of those ones, and they're given the gifts on the 26th. So when they're given their gifts on the 26th, that slowly in Britain evolves to become the tradition that we have today called Boxing Day. And Boxing Day was when the lords later on, as we go into the early modern period and the Victorian period, the lords would give the gifts to their servants. And so they'd receive a tiny little box or a small box which would contain a gift for their servants from their lord in turn. And so that starts off in the Middle Ages, where you see the lords redistributing things like wood, food, fuel, stuff like that to their key, most important retainers, and they've gathered that originally from the peasants as well. Moving on into a peasant's Christmas, it's slightly different, obviously, from the great lords in their halls and in their manor houses, but at Christmas time, the peasants now have time off, and it's a more simple time of year. They still decorate their houses, and they decorate it with any green things that they can find on the land where they live, so the holly, the ivy, things like that, and they really go out of their way to make sure that their estates look decorated. We also know that mistletoe was also a part of it. So the Christmas tradition that we have of where you hang mistletoe above a door frame, and then anyone who meets you under that door frame, you can then kiss. That originally comes from that sort of medieval period, and what they would do is they'd pluck off one of the white berries every single time a kiss was given. And so that was an important part of the tradition back then as well. They would also have a tradition that came from the Dark Ages, and this tradition was the Yule log. So you'd have a large log that would be placed in the fireplace and burnt over the 12 days of Christmas. And historians and different people are still trying to work out if this comes from the sort of the Celtic or British Iron Age, or if it comes from the sort of Anglo-Saxon Yule period, or where it comes from in history. But the Yule log would be burnt for 12 days, providing warmth, and it's also the possibility that was burnt so that you would eventually invite the sun back. If the sun saw fire burning, maybe it would return back. But again, it depends on which historian you're speaking to, which value they put on the Yule log. But that was definitely a medieval tradition, and that today we probably just see as a chocolate log that people then have as a sort of a dessert at the Christmas meal. For peasants' food, obviously you're not going to have the multiple courses or the real finery of stuff like almonds, glazed foods, huge amounts of honey, sugar, stuff like that. Instead, it's quite more simple, and you'd save up some of your meat throughout the year, and you'd have a boiled meat. You would then bring out your cheeses and stuff like that, and you'd treat yourself to more cheeses, eggs, you'd make cakes, you'd have boiled meat, and lots of ale as well, and that would be an enjoyable thing for many people to have. On the 1st of January, the peasants also celebrated something called first footing. And this was incredibly important because, again, it was all about good luck. So just like the gift giving for the lords on the 1st of January, on the 1st of January, there was the first footing, and it was at the turnover of midnight. The first person to cross the threshold into your house would then bring good luck. And there was a strong preference for someone who was of a darker complexion with fair hair, and they would be an adult male, and they would cross over the threshold and then bring good fortune with them. And how the first footing would work is that everyone would leave the house, and then at midnight they would then enter the house. And this tradition still stays in many places in Britain, and here in the northeast of England it's still very important for many different families, and it's still practiced, where everyone will leave before midnight, and then the head of the household, the father of the household, or the dad, or the grandfather, or the oldest male member of the family will then enter the house on New Year's Eve at midnight. And when he enters, he will bring in the new year and the good fortune for the whole family. And that would then continue on from there. In towns and cities, the guilds then took over a lot of the entertainment, and they would put on pageants and plays, and these were often based on biblical stories. And so different parts of the guilds would dress up in different parts of the cities and put on different Bible stories so people could go out and watch them, and there would be a great deal of entertainment. There were also medieval actors called murmurers, and these would move around, and they put on masks, and they'd do pantomimes, and they'd go around different parts of town, and sometimes even large groups of them would form together and break into the wealthy people of town's houses. And when they broke inside, they would be given food and drink in return for entertainment and good humor and music. And that would then continue on throughout the whole of the evening, and that provided a lot of different types of entertainment throughout the whole of town. Music would then also be brought in as well, and people would play a lot more music, singing folk songs and different songs throughout the year, as well as the beginning of caroling, where people would start dancing. And when they danced, the caroling, they would go around in circles, sing hymns and sing carols as they went, and it became very, very boisterous, to the point where actually caroling in the late medieval period was actually banned in England for a short period of time, just because of the fact it had become so much a part of the tradition that people were breaking inside of churches. And as they were breaking inside of churches, this actually caused the church leaders to become quite frustrated. Today, when you think of a church, you will probably think of pews lined up, and that's a Victorian thing. Before then, churches were actually halls, when you have the hall, everyone would stand and you'd have a short sermon and people would gather inside the hall. So you could come inside of the church and then carol around in circles, singing, and be getting a great deal of fun. People would also be drunk, there'd be music. And so it was seen as not the proper solemnity. And at different times, caroling would be allowed and then banned and then allowed and banned again throughout the medieval period, just because of how wild it could become. There were fun traditions too that were added into the whole of the Christmas. Traditions could be from playing sports. So for instance, hockey, medieval football, which was much more similar to sort of like rugby or American football in some ways. With a round ball, you'd pick it up and then you would then have to run to one part of the town which had been declared the goal, and there'd be maybe a side of a building or a post or something like that which would be declared the goal, and at the other side of town there'd be another end, and then any means necessary to get to the goal was allowed. This is still played in some parts of northwestern England and in other parts of England as well. In Carlisle it's called uppies and downies, so you have the two parts of the town, and then basically it's very similar to an actual medieval battle in many ways, because any rules are allowed. And in the Middle Ages, concealed weapons were also allowed, so people would get murdered while playing football. You can just imagine, you see the person with the ball, someone draws a knife, they stab them to death, then run away with the ball, score a goal, everyone's happy. It's very different to the modern day of football, or European football as we know it, not American football, where obviously today if someone falls over and twists their ankle, they're desperately trying to get a red card for the other side, whereas back then, no red cards, no yellow cards, anything goes. So you've got two armed teams basically fighting a battle to score goals in the centre of town. You can understand why eventually that also got banned in London during the Middle Ages, because it got so violent that you basically just had pitched battles at football games as well. And so that added another element into the Christmas celebration. Would the football game actually become a pitched battle as well? Two slightly similar traditions, which are quite funny in their own ways. The first one was someone would dress as a saint and then sit inside the house, and other people had to come in and make offerings to the saint. And so again, in the medieval tradition, when pilgrimage is much more common, people are going to places, you have these grand saints, relics within churches. For instance, in the northeast of England here, we've got Durham Cathedral, where the body of St Cuthbert, an Anglo-Saxon saint, his tomb was covered in silver and gold and had beautiful gems all around it and was wonderfully ornate. So in the same way as kings would go and give gifts to the saint, people would then go and have to give a good gift to the person who was acting out or dressed as a saint within your household. And so there was an element of fun and mockery in that as well. That would cause people to laugh as the person had to act all saintly, fitting of someone who has the power of a saint, and then give out blessings and stuff like that as well. And on the other side, there was the other tradition, which was called the king who does not lie. And what would happen is people could go up to the king who does not lie and they could ask questions, and the king who does not lie must answer the question truthfully. And in turn, they then, if they answer the question truthfully, can then ask questions back to the questioner. And so this was a way that many people could then maybe sort of like play games with their friends and family. Maybe if someone had a crush or they really liked someone, they could ask a direct question at this time, and then they have to answer truthfully, and then they can answer back. And so this would always be a part of the goodwill and the good feelings of that time, of that period of Christmas as well. Right at the end of the festival, there was also on the 7th of January was St. Distaff's Day. And on this day, it was another day of misrule. So obviously, right to bring the festival to the end, obviously people would be quite like, oh, Christmas is over, that sort of thing. And they would feel the end of the festival coming too. And so you'd have another day of mayhem and weirdness and fun. And at this time, it was actually seen as a sort of a day to have a battle of the sexes. So men would go out of their way to try and set fire to women's flax that they had spun during the winter period. And then at the same time, women would go out of their way to soak men as they went around the place. So you can imagine them hiding behind buildings, coming out with a bucket of water, while the guys are trying to go in and cause mayhem to the work they've done, unpick their work, stuff like that. And so that was, again, bringing together all of the mayhem of the Christmas period into a last little bit of fun before you return to work on the 8th of January. And then from there, life continues as always. And so the Christmas festival is that bringing together of the different traditions, some of them which would have continued from the Anglo-Saxon period, and new ones which would have evolved. And so that would then create the understanding of the Christmas festival and how much of an enjoyable 12-day period that would be for all the people within society during the Middle Ages. So I really hope you've enjoyed this episode as we've looked at medieval Christmas with its feasting, with its enjoyment, with its parties and all the things encompassed within that. Please do like and subscribe. Write a comment down below. As you know, I really enjoy interacting with you there, and I really hope you'll join me for the next episode soon. But until next time, stay safe and well, and Merry Christmas.